Empezamos, si os parece. David, if you're ready, we're going to start.
Okay.
So I guess I don't need to introduce you. I guess everybody here in the room after those 2 days know you. And as agreed, what we're going to do is a Q&A session with the questions that, as I told you, people send on a little system we put together.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the first question is, if you're really a programmer, or did the people at 37 Signals found you in a casting or something? And tell us the story. How did you meet them from Copenhagen to Chicago?
Sure. I met Jason Fried and the rest of 37 Signals back in 2001. I was a big fan of 37 Signals. At the time, the company was doing web design work for clients, and they had a very popular blog called Signal versus Noise, which is still in effect today. And Jason Fried was trying to learn PHP. He had an intention of building a web application, so he had set out to learn PHP on his own, and he had kind of put something kind of working together, but wasn't entirely happy with it, and I believe he was stuck on pagination. So he made a post to Signal versus Noise explaining, this is where I am, I need help. So I wrote him back a long detailed letter on how to do pagination in PHP, and he liked that response so much that he thought, wait a minute, I mean, if I can get this guy, who obviously can explain to me how things are supposed to work, to just do it instead, wouldn't that be better? And that's what he ended up deciding. So he hired me and gave up learning PHP instead.
Okay.
So that's how I got involved with the first project of 37 Signals. I didn't work with them as a consultant for a good number of years until about 3 years ago when we started work on Basecamp. That took about 3, 4, 5 months to get all wrapped up and released. And about, I think, 5, 6 months after the release of Basecamp, I joined 37 Signals more permanently. I was done with school and so on and so forth.
Okay, thanks. Well, let's get a bit more into more technical questions, and
Sure.
And one of the questions that made it to the top is, which are the most relevant features about Rails 1.2?
Sure. The great thing about Rails 1.2 is that we actually just released the first release candidate. We released that late on Wednesday night, and it's available for anybody to try. There's beta gems and everything. But the major features are twofold. First, we have the REST approach. That's the whole notion of starting to deal with resources, starting to deal with a greater understanding of HTTP, use a fuller, richer set of the features that HTTP gives us to make it easier to create web applications that can work in multiple formats, that uses multiple verbs, that are easier to turn into an API, and so on and so forth. The interesting thing about this move to REST-based web applications for Rails is that it's not only about the client. It's not only about giving your application multiple entries. It's not only about presenting the same data in XML or making an API or RSS. It's also about how you construct your controllers. And in the past, controllers has been one of those things where lots of people did it very differently. Some had very small controllers, just 3, 4, 5 actions. Some had huge controllers, 10, 15, 20, 25, 50 actions in a single controller. So there was a lot of different approaches to how many actions should you put in one controller, what's the scope, what's the separation of concern, so on and so forth, which wasn't really that helpful. I find it usually to be better if you have one recommended approach. So you get a uniform design across multiple applications, across multiple programmers. And we had that in a lot of other ways. We had that in the model and to some aspects in the view, but the controller was really this big open playground where everybody could just invent their own conventions and how to do things. And there's a reason we call Rails a framework of convention over configuration. That you're supposed to have a number of conventions just available to you that you can follow. So that's a big part of what the REST stuff does. It's code organization.
Okay.
So REST stuff is one of the aspects. Another aspect kind of the REST stuff, or at least of the enhanced HTTP use, is that we're making it much, much easier to use a single action, multiple formats. So for example, if you have a weblog system, you have a posts controller and an index action. An index action shows all the recent posts on the weblog. You might very well want to present that index in HTML. In Ajax, that means in JavaScript when you do live updates. In XML, in RSS, in Atom, in comma-separated files. There's a lot of different formats you could want to present this index action in. And in the past, you'd have to make 5 individual actions. Or you can just make one, use a respond to block, and then you can put the format in the URL. So if you have /posts /5, then you'll get the HTML version. If it's /5.xml, you get the XML version. So on and so forth. Make it very, very easy to present multiple formats from the same actions. So that's 2 of the things. The last major improvement is around Unicode, or multibytes. In the past, Rails has made it easy enough to store and display Unicode. But oftentimes you need to manipulate Unicode, and that's where Rails and Ruby in general has made it a little bit hard to deal with that. You had to jump a fair amount of hoops, you had to set K-code yourself, you had to use different methods to get the length and truncate and so on and so forth. But now, with Rails 1.2, we've rolled it all into Rails. We've rolled in the assumption that your web application will be Unicode. That every data point is coming in as UTF-8, which means that, for example, in the past, validations in active record models has been one of those things that just didn't work with Unicode. You have validates length of name, minimum 5. You have to have a string of at least 5 characters. If you used a multibyte that took up 3 bytes, or a Unicode character that took up 3 bytes, you would only have 2 left and not 4. So you would get a lot of errors like that didn't make sense. Even worse, if you were using truncate or reverse or any string manipulation that alters the string itself, you could get an invalid Unicode string. Because if you say truncate 5, and at position 5 is a Unicode character, it cut it in half. You would only keep perhaps 1 byte out of 3, meaning an invalid character. So it's pretty nice that we've now taken care of all that. As soon as you start any new application on 1.2 or upgrade an existing application to 1.2, all of this will just automatically work. We've made all the initial helpers, the validations, and the string manipulations that ship in Rails automatically work with UTF-8. You can call truncate in your views, it'll work. You can call validations in your models, it'll work. You can call string manipulations such as first or last or from or at in your models or in your controllers, and it'll automatically work. And we've presented at any time you need to manipulate strings as UTF-8 or as multibyte, you can call string.chars. Yours will give you a character proxy to that string. It operates on a character level instead of a byte level, and everything is peachy. So it really moves Rails a big step closer to being just out-of-the-box easy to use for international applications.
Okay.
I'd say those are the three major things. We have a lot of other features. I think we have hundreds and hundreds of changes, minor fixes, upgrades, and so on and so forth. I should actually mention one other thing that's not a feature, but it's important nonetheless. That's deprecation. So we have the intention now of moving straight from Rails 1.2 to Rails 2.0. And that means there's a fair amount of legacy API calls that we've been supporting in Rails for a long time that we want to get rid of now. Old ways of doing things that are no longer relevant because there's an improved, better version of that API. And we haven't wanted to remove it outright from Rails 1.2 or any of the other Rails.x versions because we didn't want to break backwards compatibility. But now that Rails 2.0 is coming up on the horizon, we want to make sure that people are ready. So Rails 1.2 contains a bunch of deprecations. When you run your application in development mode, you'll get deprecation notices in your development log, so you can see what are the parts of the API that I should update in my application.
Okay. One of the recurrent themes here in the conference this day is being scalability and agile development on big projects, and the question is, which is the biggest project you're aware of in Rails?
That's a good question. I was just talking recently to Jason Hoffman, who is the technical director of TextDrive and Joyent. And they've been doing some amazing scalability work with Rails. He was telling me about one setup they had, a test setup with a Rails application. I believe it was the CMS Radiant, that he had set up on, I think, 15 machines behind a big IP box, as it's called. He was doing 8,000 requests per second. So that's obviously one of those numbers that's absolutely huge. Like, very few applications will ever get to that point of load. And he showed that Rails could not easily, at least possibly, scale to that immense size. But on a more practical level, of a fair amount of applications currently in development that would be labeled as so-called big enterprise installations or developments that I can't talk too much about. It seems to be perhaps around 3, 4, 5, 6 months ago, there was a big uptake from a number of very prominent big names in business of Rails. And they're just now finishing up their initial applications and looking to launch them in the beginning of next year. But of the applications that's out right now, I usually point to examples such as 43 things, 43 places, 43 people. Who's doing, I believe, 5 million dynamic page views a day. I also, of course, point to our own applications at 37 Signals. We're doing a somewhat similar number. And there's a ton of other big applications out there. I don't track that too much. For me, it's not an open question anymore. Rails can scale. It's been proved both theoretically and practically. So it's just not something I find terribly interested in tracking anymore. I understand that in some circles, Rails is still considered new and unproven, by the fact that I've been working on it for 3 years. So for me, it doesn't feel very new or unproven, and I've seen it scale to the over 1 million customers we have at 37 Signals, people using our application. I've seen it scale to the hundreds of thousands of people using 43 things, and I've seen technical proofs, such as the one Jason Hoffman is making with 8,000 requests a second on a Rails application. So, for me, it's a done subject. It's a answered question.
Okay. The next question on the list was, what do you think will be the impact on Rails of the new virtual machines like JRuby or Jarv or those kind of things?
To be honest, I almost don't care. Rails on Ruby is fast enough. You can do 8,000 requests per second on the current Ruby. I mean, what more do you want? It'd be nice if Ruby was slightly faster, so you would use slightly less hardware to get the same performance numbers. But in the big picture of things, it's just not a big deal. Ruby has always been fast enough for me, and in those incredibly rare cases Ruby is currently not fast enough, it's usually a good idea to throw away Ruby and any other dynamic language altogether and just rewrite that tiny bit of functionality that needs to be incredibly fast in C. We did exactly that for our Campfire product. Campfire is an online chat application where we have thousands of people connected to the system at the same time that polls the system every 3 seconds. The entire web application was made in Rails, and we just had this tiny bottleneck. We have the bottleneck of whenever people ping, do I have a new message in the chat room for me? I have a new message in the chat room for me. They would repeat that question over and over again. And it was a tiny query. It was just 2 database calls against the database. So we took those 100 lines of Ruby code, rewrote them in 300 lines of C over the course of 4 hours. And all of a sudden, we had no performance or scalability problems anymore. So I think a lot of applications can follow that model. If you should ever get into the problem where you have some important bottleneck somewhere in your system, it's usually pretty easy to isolate that bottleneck and rewrite it in something incredibly fast. Do note, though, Campfire is the only application where we've ever needed to do that. We have 4 other applications and a couple more in the pipeline, and we've not ever had the need to do that before. So, faster Ruby, great if it arrives. Don't give much of a damn if it doesn't.
Okay. The next question is, most of us, or all of us here, love Ruby on Rails. What is what you like the less about about Rails, and what will you change if you have to start again from zero?
That's a good question. There's a good number of API choices that we're now bound to provide because of backwards compatibility. One of the most prolific features that I've been sorry we ever introduced were components. I really don't think that they're a good idea for developing this kind of request-based applications as we do in Rails. I think that they were a mistake. I think they were done out of spite. I basically sat down after reading a second or third weblog post saying, oh, Rails is great, but it doesn't support components, so I can't use it. But to hell with it, I'll implement components, and I implemented components in half a day, and I thought, now Rails can also do components. But that's not a good way to develop new features. To do that out of spite, because it turned out I never ever needed components, and whenever I tried to shoehorn components into my applications, I made them worse. And the problem with components was that they served as a distraction. A lot of people coming to Rails thought, hey, components, that's a great idea, let me use that all over my application, and they ended up with something that was very far from what you would call the best practice Rails application. So I just don't think that we need that kind of distraction in the choices you can make in architectures around Rails. A Rails architecture should be not even a question. It should be just automatic. How you put your Rails application together should be largely common sense. It should be void of big architectural decisions. So components definitely must die. Perhaps the other big thing I regret slightly is including Action Web Service in Rails proper. And it's also going to leave Rails proper from Rails 1.2. It's still going to be there as a web framework, but slowly but surely come to the realization that SOAP is evil. It's a terrible approach to tying applications together, and there's a much, much better approach out there, and it's called HTTP. And the ways of using HTTP to tie applications together is going under the banner of REST. So I've obviously and not very quietly pronounced that I think REST is the way that we should make applications on the web play together, not by implementing something like Corva on top of HTTP and think that we're playing well with the rest of the web. So I wouldn't have supported SOAP as well as putting it into the core if I had to do that again.
Okay. Next question is, being you Danish and aware about the lingual diversity here in Europe and worldwide, why is that the Rails core doesn't support internationalization, and will it be available in the course on time, or what's your view here?
My view is that I'm still undecided. The interesting fact about internationalization is that people talk about it as though it was one thing, as though there was one solution that would magically sprinkle internationalization, pixie dust across your application, and whammo, you have it available in 30 languages perfectly. That's not how the real work works. Internationalization is many things to many people. And I'm unsure of whether there is one size fits all on this problem. I think that there are many different needs. Some have very simple needs. They just want to translate a few strings. That doesn't require very much. Some people have more advanced needs, and they want to set commas or punctuation differently in numbers according to locals. That's a slightly more advanced problem. And there's a lot of shades within that spectrum. How much do you really want to internationalize your application? How much is it worth to do? And in Rails, we already have, I believe, 4 internationalization packages sitting on different points in this scale. That some of the plugins are very, very simple. They just translate strings. Some of them also deal with locals, deal with how should we format dates, how should we format numbers, and so on and so forth, all the way up to doing everything possible to format it in an internationalized way. And I think the funny thing is that people point to these 4 different approaches and say, we just want one. I mean, the whole point of there being 4 different plugins right now is not just because they like a different shade of gray. It's because they are all fundamentally different, because they address fundamentally different needs. So what we're going to do starting out with Rails is making sure that it's very easy for somebody to do their own internationalization again or set up in their own application. So Rails shouldn't have hard-coded English terms that are hard to overwrite. So that's going to be the first push, and hopefully we'll get that push done by 2.0. There's no string, there's no element of Rails that's not easily overwritable to present in a different language. I wouldn't hold my breath for standardized internationalization set up in Rails just yet. It might well be that one solution emerges that looks like it's going to be what most people need most of the time. That's the baseline assumption or baseline area that any new feature in Rails needs to climb. Is this something that most people would use most of the time? If it's not, it's doubtful that it makes it into core, and it's probably more suitable for a plugin.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hello? Oh, okay. So let's keep going. I guess you don't do much consulting work any longer, but what would you take an IT manager of one of those big, huge corporations to convince him to start using Ruby on Rails?
You're right. I don't do any consulting anymore, and I've also bumped off the evangelization banner for somebody who's not automatically interested. I don't interest myself in trying to convince people who generally are negative or don't have an initial self-interest in Rails. But I'd say if you are in that position and if you have to convince somebody to use Ruby on Rails in a situation where they're perhaps not just self-interested, I would just point to making it work on your own. Rails is so easy to get into. Rails is so easy to make a test application that there's no reason to rely on outside arguments. Try it out for yourself. You can put a few of your developers to work, and within a few hours or even a few days, they can have a working application. And you can evaluate that as a pleasant experience. Are we believing that that's likely to improve our productivity? If so, then you are putting yourself in a position where you realize the potential benefits. And then you can look at the potential risks. You can start looking at how many people are doing Rails, or anybody making this scale, or so on and so forth. But I don't believe it's worth looking into those risks before you have an initial enthusiasm for working in Rails starting out. If you just start out comparing the risks, Java will look best. If the only thing you worry about is minimizing risk, there's a lot of COBOL probably looks pretty good. I think that that's just not a very sensible approach to evaluations. You need to include the benefits, of course. And it's very hard to measure those benefits just by looking at bullet points. You have to actually feel what it is like to build a web application in Rails and whether that gives you the productivity benefits that would outweigh the risks.
Okay, let's go to the next one, and why is it that you don't like engines?
I don't like what?
Engines? Yeah.
Okay. I think that they're, in large part, at a wrong level of abstraction. I do believe that there is a tiny sliver of circumstances where engines is the right solution. For sharing complete modules inside your own organization between very similar applications, it might have a good use. Where I don't think it has a good use is as a large-scale, general-purpose code-sharing mechanism. I don't think that the kind of things you should try to share in Rails are views and controllers. Views and controllers should be so simple anyway that those are really the parts where you tie the application together, where you make it special just for your application. I think that the right level of abstraction is instead in the model, libraries, in modules you mix in code that does not include views, in code that does not include controllers. So I think engines in large ways are just, they're trying to abstract too much. They're trying to abstract things where most people don't need the same thing most of the time, where there's too much configuration to be done after installing an engine, where there's too little gain by abstraction, too little gain by sharing.
Okay, let's get a bit more soft. It was too technical up to this point, and the next question is, how do you see Rails in 5 years, and mainly not only the technology but also the community?
I see Rails in 5 years as still making programmers happy with their daily work. That's ultimate test for Rails. Is it still making people happy doing programming? If it's not, it'll no longer be relevant. So whatever it is that in 5 years' time makes people happy about web development is where Rails would be. That's, of course, a very loose answer, but it's also very true, because I have no idea where Rails will be. I had no idea where Rails would be a year ago. I had no idea that REST would be this major new feature that we would try to pursue. 6 months before we introduced RDS, I had no idea that AJAX would be a big direction for Rails. So, a big part of guiding Rails in making sure that we have no plans. Because as soon as you have plans, as soon as you have a roadmap, you're locking yourself into an old version of the future. I, in general, think that that's a pretty bad idea. I do think, though, that Rails in 5 years' time will be a very established name. We will no longer be getting questions at conferences like, does Rails scale? There will be a solved question that the mainstream development community will just have accepted the fact that, yes, it does. And I think that IT departments across organizations everywhere just won't have to fight very hard to get a Rails project off the ground. I don't think we have to wait 5 years for that, though. I think within the next year to perhaps two, we'll see Rails have as much mainstream acceptance as a viable choice as PHP may have now. And I think it's very interesting to look at PHP, because if you look back even 2 or 3 years ago, there are tons and tons of companies saying PHP is not proven, PHP does not scale, blah, 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 blah. And today, nobody questions that, really.
Okay. The next question is related with open source, and the question is, being a software developer, sometimes you have decided to release software as open source, as you did with Rails, and other times you haven't, developing proprietary software. Where do you see the open software, let's call it strategy, is clearly beneficial and superior over other alternatives?
For me, the split is very easy. For infrastructure, open source is more or less the only viable choice I see. For plumbing, like Rails, like Apache, like MySQL, like Linux, like FreeBSD, like all of those infrastructure pieces, open source is clearly the dominant, most viable strategy to develop great software. But on end-user applications, not so much. There are definitely a few exceptions. Firefox is an obvious exception to an end-user application that is really good. But I've not seen a lot of other examples like that. And the reason why is end-user applications just require a very different mindset from infrastructure, and it requires different kinds of people than just programmers. It requires good designers, it requires good project management, it requires a lot of different things that are not as necessary or as hard in infrastructure level developments as it is in end-user development. And so for me, it doesn't make sense to have applications like Basecamp or Campfire or the other applications that we're doing at 37 Signals open source. Partly because I think that they wouldn't be very good. The big reason Basecamp is good is because we say no all the time. And in open source, usually it's a lot about saying yes to new contributions and so on and so forth. And also because I want to eat. I don't want to be a starving artist. I think it's great to have open source, and I think it can live very well alongside proprietary software, because I don't think that software is purely an altruistic pursuit. I think it's very good that we have a viable economic structure around software as well. But there is something called proprietary software. For the same reason that I love my Mac. I love OS 10. I love iPhoto. I love a lot of applications on the Mac that are not open source. At the same time, I can appreciate that a lot of the applications or infrastructure I do run on my Mac is open source. So I don't see them as heading off, as being a fight once against each other. I just see that they're appropriate for different types of development.
We know that you spend some time working on the Rails core and doing development for the Rails applications, and also you spend your time on Basecamp and the other apps you're developing. How do you split your time, and which one you like most? Which one makes you more happy?
I split my time usually in daytime and daily hours. I work on Rails when I need it for 37 Signals applications. So that's how a lot of new features get into Rails. I simply need them for whatever application I'm working on right now, so I put it into Rails. That's how S came to be, that's how RJS came to be, that's how just about any major important feature in Rails came to be, because I needed it for 37 Signals applications first. And I love the split. I love being able to work on infrastructure, but I don't think just working on infrastructure alone makes sense. If you work on infrastructure in a vacuum, if that's all you do, I don't think you make very good choices. I think you need the pushback from real applications and real needs to make good design choices. It's very, very easy if you just work on infrastructure to make very academic decisions, make very theoretical decisions about things that might look nice, to sound nice in example code, but just doesn't work very well in real-world code on real-world demands. So it's yin and yang. You need both parts of it, and it's the intersection of both that makes me happy.
Okay. What do you think will be the next big thing? And the question is related one. What are you guys up to in 37 Signals?
We're working on a couple of new applications. I'm personally working on something called Sunrise that we've alluded to a little bit in the past. We're still not ready to talk too much about it, but Sunrise has been a major driver in getting all the REST functionality put together in Rails. I've been extracting a lot of all that stuff from Sunrise. In terms of what's next in Rails, we already have a fair number of things lined up for Rails 2.0. One of them is something I presented on at RailsConf Europe, which is something we call Simply Helpful, which is basically about making the view simpler, making the view run on conventions too, making models play a bigger part and reduce duplication, make the views more dry. So that's going to be one of the major pushes that we're currently developing in a plugin, and that will eventually make its way into Rails 2.0. I also have another theme that I've been playing with in Sunrise, which is something called presenters. Presenters is basically an object-oriented counterpart of helpers. So currently helpers are just procedural
It seems they do not allow you to talk about this. Hello? Yes, ¿vamos bien? Hello? ¿Podemos colgar y volver a llamar? That's it. There we go.
Okay.
It seems someone doesn't want you to talk about this, so.
Right. What was the last you caught?
You were talking about presenters, and they are like, yeah?
Sure. So presenters are object-oriented versions of helpers. Helpers are great when you just transform one value, like number to currency or truncate or something like that. If you need to present a more complicated view, you have multiple helper methods that depend on each other. Then you're starting to feel the pain of not being object-oriented. You start feeling the pain of not having behavior and attributes available in one package. So presenters is basically a way to rectify that. When you have really complex UIs, oftentimes involving Ajax, where you have multiple drop-downs depending on data that depends on something else and so on and so forth, it's really helpful to have an object-oriented notion of how to deal with that in the view. And presenters is the pattern that I'm currently exploring for dealing with that. I fully expect that that'll be one of the more interesting features of Rails 2.0 as well. So those would be the two current trends that we're tracking.
Okay. The last one from the list will be, what will you ask yourself that we haven't? Is there anything you want to tell us about that we haven't talked that you can think of us?
Well, I just want to encourage everybody at the conference to check out Rails 1.2, the release candidate 1. Help us test that. Help us submit regression bugs. Does it work in your current application? If not, why? And then we can get Rails 1.2 shipped in a short order.
Okay. Yo creo que tenemos tiempo para una pregunta desde la sala. We can take one question from the audience, and if anyone.
Sure.
Si alguien le da cosa al inglés, yo la traduzco, ¿no? Espera, necesitas el micrófono.
Hi. Have you looked into behavior-driven development and especially the RSpec plugin and the way it handles specifications rather than tests? And are there any future for that in Rails, or will it stay in the outskirts?
I think BDD, behavior-driven development, is a very interesting development, and I'm tracking it. I mean, right now, I'm not feeling a whole lot of pain in unit testing. It's not an area of web development where I'm currently, not web development, it's, in general, testing of web development is a pain in the ass, but I think we do a pretty damn good job in Rails currently of making that a lot easier. And I'm just not feeling a big pain there. So it's not something where I'm currently exploring other options because I'm not thinking to myself, if only this was easier. It might come one day, maybe I'm just not paying close enough attention, and a big revelation will come, and I'll be the first one to champion it if that happens. But until then, I think that I personally just have other things that I want to pursue and dig into. But I think it's absolutely fantastic that people are exploring these things, and hopefully the plugin structure is making it easy enough for people who find this approach interesting to use it in their own applications.
Okay, and the last question, Pablo.
Hello, David. There is some initiatives to put some better experience in the side of the browser, like XUL from Mozilla, or even to put like Lombots, some flash rendering directly to the browser, or even the line that is following Microsoft with XAML. The question is, first question, which future do you see for those initiatives? And second, do you think there's sometime we'll be having Ruby directly in the browser side instead of JavaScript?
First, on alternative display techniques, I think it's great that people are pushing the envelope, but in large part, many web applications just don't have those needs. Forms, HTML, and Ajax is plenty to make 95% of all web applications behave really well. So I don't see it as a mainstream thing yet. I think that especially Flash is very interesting when you have isolated, high interactive widgets, something you have to manipulate with lots of colors or pictures or whatever. It can be pretty good. But it's just not too interesting to me. I find very small targeted uses of something like Flash. So, for example, in Campfire, we actually use Flash to play the alert sounds when a new message comes in. We use Flash to play that sound because HTML is terrible at playing music. And I think that sites like YouTube and other video sites have shown that Flash is fantastic for playing video too. I think that's where the good fit for Flash is. Those multimedia aspects of things. But most applications just don't need multimedia. And that's the boring fact. And for those applications, I think HTML, the technologies we already have are pretty good. They can become better, definitely. But I see what we should improve is instead HTML, CSS, and so on, rather than throw everything out and try to go down something like Zool or whatever Microsoft is doing, so on and so forth. And regarding Ruby in the browser, it'd be nice, but JavaScript is actually already a very changeable language. And if you use JavaScript together with something like Prototype, you get something that looks very much like Ruby, because you can change JavaScript enough that it almost feels like Ruby. It'd be great to have real Ruby, but the absence of that, and I don't think that there's any immediate future for Ruby in the browser, because anything that needs to go into the browser has a multiple-year introduction path. So even if all the browser vendors today decided that we'll start supporting Ruby in the browser, it'll be 3-4 years before it's something we can actually use. So I'd say bring your Ruby to JavaScript instead. And we've done that with Prototype.
Okay, so David, thank you very much for your time, for being with us. We just hope that next year, if we get together, you can be with us in the spirit of the community that has been around these 2 days. And thank you for your time. Gracias.